This is the story of how one night in 2004 led to 2 decades of questions, legal battles, and a search for truth that went all the way to the Supreme Court. If you're intrigued by true crime mysteries and want to see how this unfolds, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what case we should cover next. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Let's go back to where it all began. Farmersville, Texas, 2004. A quiet place where everyone knows everyone. The kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked and wave to neighbors. But on one summer night, that sense of safety shattered. A young woman named Rochelle Tollison lived there. She was only 20 years old, full of life and dreams. Rochelle had recently become a mother to a baby girl named Avery, who was just 5 months old. Being a new mom wasn't easy, but Rochelle loved her daughter more than anything in the world. In the summer of 2004, Rochelle disappeared. One moment she was going about her normal life, and the next, she was gone. Her family became frantic. Where was she? What happened? In a small town like Farmersville, people don't just vanish without a trace. The police started searching immediately. They talked to neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen something. Hours turned into days. The worry grew heavier with each passing moment. Then, investigators got a lead. A name surfaced in their investigation: Moises Mendoza. He was someone Rochelle knew. Not well, but they had crossed paths. Witnesses had seen them together around the time she disappeared. When police found Mendoza, they noticed something strange. He seemed nervous, anxious. His story kept changing. First, he said one thing, then another. Detectives have seen this before. When someone's lying, their story doesn't stay straight. They pressed him harder with questions. Where were you? When did you last see Rochelle? What happened that night? Finally, the truth started to come out, piece by piece. And what Mendoza revealed was devastating. Rochelle hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken, held against her will, hurt in ways no person should ever experience. And then, her life had been taken from her. The details were so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they heard. Mendoza led the police to where Rochelle's body could be found. The confirmation of her death sent shockwaves through Farmersville. A young mother, her whole life ahead of her, gone forever. Baby Avery would grow up without ever knowing her mom's embrace. The evidence against Mendoza quickly piled up. He had admitted to what happened. There were witnesses who saw them together. Physical evidence connected him to the crime. It seemed like an open and shut case. In 2005, Moises Mendoza stood trial in Collin County. The prosecution presented their case. Here was a man who had committed a horrible crime, who had taken an innocent life, who had left a baby without a mother. The defense tried to argue their side, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated and came back with their verdict: guilty. But that wasn't the end. In Texas, when someone is convicted of capital murder, the jury must decide the punishment. Should this person spend life in prison, or should they face the death penalty? The jury looked at all the facts. They considered Mendoza's past, the nature of the crime, and whether he posed a future danger to society. After careful thought, they made their decision: death by lethal injection. Mendoza was sent to death row, where Texas houses inmates awaiting execution. For most people, this would be the end of the story. Crime committed, trial held, justice served. Appeal after appeal was filed. Each one went to different courts, climbing higher and higher through the legal system. From Texas state courts to federal courts, from district judges to circuit courts. Every time an appeal was denied, the lawyers filed another one. They were looking for any legal reason to stop the execution, any crack in the case that might save their client's life. Meanwhile, Rochelle's family waited. Year after year, they hoped for closure, for the sentence to finally be carried out. But the appeals kept coming, and the wait continued. The case files grew thicker. Legal briefs stacked higher. Judges reviewed the same facts over and over, looking for errors that might have affected the trial's outcome. Some appeals claimed Mendoza's trial lawyers should have investigated more, should have presented different witnesses, should have fought harder. The courts examined these claims carefully, but ultimately rejected them. Other appeals focused on witness testimony from the trial. Was everything that was said truthful? Were there contradictions? The courts reviewed the trial transcripts line by line. Through it all, one question remained at the center. Had justice been properly served, or were there flaws in how this case was handled? As the years passed, Mendoza remained on death row, living in a small cell, waiting. The legal battles continued, but time was running out. By 2025, 20 years had passed since his conviction. Most of his appeals had been exhausted. The higher courts had reviewed his case multiple times. Unless something dramatic happened, the execution would finally take place. But there was one last chance. The Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court. 9 justices who have the final say on the most important legal questions in America. For someone on death row, getting the Supreme Court to hear your case is incredibly rare. Thousands of appeals reach them every year, but they only accept a tiny fraction. Moises Mendoza's lawyers prepared their final petition. They gathered all their arguments, all the reasons they believe the execution should be stopped. They submitted it to the Supreme Court, hoping, praying for a miracle. Days passed, then weeks. Everyone waited for the court's decision. Then the answer came, denied. The Supreme Court would not hear the case. They saw no reason to intervene. The lower courts had reviewed everything thoroughly, and there was no legal error significant enough to warrant stopping the execution. For Mendoza, this was devastating news. The last door had closed. The final appeal had failed. But there was still one more option, though it was a long shot: clemency. In Texas, there's a group called the Board of Pardons and Paroles. They have the power to recommend mercy, to ask the governor to stop an execution or reduce a sentence to life in prison. It's not about whether someone is guilty or innocent. It's about whether mercy should be shown. Mendoza's supporters made their case to the board. They talked about rehabilitation, about whether executing someone after 20 years served any purpose, about the value of human life. The board listened. They reviewed the materials submitted. They considered all the arguments. Their decision? No recommendation for clemency. Without the board's recommendation, the Texas governor wouldn't stop the execution. The path forward was now clear and unavoidable. The execution date was set, April 23, 2025. As that day approached, Mendoza knew his time was almost up. 21 years after Rochelle Tollison's life ended, his would too. On April 23rd, preparations began at the Huntsville unit, the prison where Texas carries out executions. This facility has a special room designed for this purpose. A small chamber with a gurney where the condemned person lies down. Witnesses gathered. By law, certain people are allowed to watch executions: family members of the victim, media representatives, prison officials, and sometimes spiritual advisors. Rochelle's family members were there. After waiting 21 years for this moment, they wanted to see justice carried out. The pain of losing Rochelle had never fully healed. Avery, Rochelle's daughter, had grown up without her mother. She was now 21 years old herself, the same age her mother was when she died. The weight of that reality hung heavy in the air. Mendoza was brought into the execution chamber. He was strapped to the gurney, his arms extended. Medical personnel prepared the 4 lines that would deliver the lethal drugs. In his final moments, Mendoza was given a chance to speak, his last statement to the world. What would he say? Would he apologize to Rochelle's family? Would he express remorse for what he'd done? Would he maintain his innocence despite the conviction? Mendoza spoke briefly. His words were recorded, as all final statements are. He acknowledged the pain caused, the lives affected. But the details of what he said would be analyzed and debated by those who study such things. What do you think about cases like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. At 6:40 p.m., Moises Mendoza was pronounced dead. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because even after someone is executed, questions often remain. Remember those appeals Mendoza filed? Some of them raised concerns about his original trial. His lawyers claimed that his defense attorneys back in 2005 didn't do a thorough enough job. They said witnesses should have been interviewed more carefully. They argued that certain evidence wasn't properly investigated. Were these valid concerns, or just legal tactics to delay the inevitable? The courts that reviewed these claims said the trial was fair. They found that even if the defense could have done some things differently, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. The evidence against Mendoza was simply too strong. There's another layer to this story that's worth exploring. Mendoza's case wasn't unusual in terms of how long it took. Death penalty cases in America typically take many years, sometimes decades, from conviction to execution. Critics of this system say it's too slow, that justice delayed is justice denied, that families wait far too long for closure. Both sides have valid points. In Mendoza's case, the 20-year wait meant that Avery grew up entirely without her mother, waiting all those years for the sentence to be carried out. For the family, each appeal felt like reopening an old wound. But those same 20 years gave Mendoza's lawyers time to examine every aspect of his case, to look for any possible error that might have wrongly convicted him. The courts ultimately decided the conviction was solid and the trial was fair. After the execution, Rochelle's family spoke to the media. They talked about finally having closure, about being able to move forward after 2 decades of waiting. They remembered Rochelle, not just as a victim, but as a daughter, a mother, a person who loved and was loved. One family member said that while the execution couldn't bring Rochelle back, it brought a sense that justice had been done, that there were consequences for taking an innocent life. But even with the execution complete, aspects of this case continue to spark discussion among legal experts. Others look at the witness testimony from the trial. Appeals claim there were inconsistencies that should have been explored more deeply. Again, the courts found these arguments unpersuasive, but they show how every detail gets scrutinized when someone's life is on the line. There's also the broader question of deterrence. Does the death penalty actually prevent future crimes? Or does it simply serve as punishment for past ones? Texas has carried out more executions than any other state. Supporters say this shows a commitment to justice and public safety. Critics argue it raises questions about whether the system works fairly across all cases. Let's talk about something that many people don't fully understand. What actually happens during the years someone spends on death row? For Moises Mendoza, those 20 years weren't spent in a regular prison cell. Death row is different. It's a separate section of the prison where inmates live under strict conditions, knowing that one day, unless something changes, they will be executed. The days are long and repetitive. Wake up, eat meals delivered to the cell, maybe get an hour of recreation time, read books, write letters, meet with lawyers, and sleep. Then do it all again the next day, and the next, for 20 years. During this time, Mendoza had visits from his attorneys, who were constantly working on appeals. They'd review trial transcripts, look for new evidence, search for legal arguments that might save his life. Each meeting carried hope that maybe this appeal would be the one that worked. But appeal after appeal was denied. Imagine living with that uncertainty, not knowing if you have months or years left. Hearing about other inmates whose execution dates get set. Watching some get their sentences reduced while others are led away to the execution chamber. This psychological aspect of death row is something experts have studied extensively. Some call it cruel, arguing that the long wait itself becomes a form of punishment beyond the execution. Others say it's necessary to ensure justice is properly served. For Rochelle's family, those same 20 years felt entirely different. They weren't waiting in a cell, they were living their lives, but with a shadow always hanging over them. Every time an appeal was filed, they had to relive the trauma. Every court hearing brought back painful memories. Avery, Rochelle's daughter, grew up during this time. She learned to walk, started school, became a teenager, graduated high school, became an adult, all without her mother there to see it. Think about all the moments Rochelle missed. First words, first day of school, birthday parties, graduations, all the little moments that make up a childhood. Gone because of one terrible night in 2004. The impact of crime ripples outward like stones thrown in water. It doesn't just affect the immediate victim. It touches families, friends, communities. Years later, people are still dealing with the consequences. Farmersville, that small town where this happened, had to process what occurred within their community. Neighbors who thought they knew everyone suddenly realized how much can hide beneath the surface. Trust was shaken. Back to the legal process. because understanding what happened in court helps us understand why this case took so long. After Mendoza was convicted in 2005, his first appeal went to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. This is standard procedure in death penalty cases. The appeals court reviews the trial to check for errors. Mendoza's lawyers argued several points. They said his trial attorneys didn't properly investigate certain aspects of the case. They claimed some witness testimony was problematic. They looked for any mistake that might have affected the verdict. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals examined these arguments carefully. They read through trial transcripts, looked at evidence, considered legal precedents. Their conclusion? The trial was conducted properly. No errors significant enough to overturn the conviction. But that wasn't the end. In capital cases, defendants can file what's called a habeas corpus petition. This is a legal document that says, "You're holding me unlawfully," and asks courts to review whether someone's imprisonment or death sentence is justified. Mendoza filed habeas petitions in both state and federal court. These petitions raised new arguments, looked at issues from different angles, and sought any possible way to avoid execution. Federal courts got involved because constitutional questions were raised. Did Mendoza receive effective assistance of counsel as guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment? Was his trial fair? Were his rights violated in any way? Federal judges reviewed the case independently. They didn't just accept what state courts said, they conducted their own analysis. This is part of why death penalty cases take so long. Multiple levels of courts, each examining the case from scratch. After federal district courts ruled against him, Mendoza appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Another review, another examination of the facts and law, another denial. Throughout this process, legal standards had to be met. Courts don't just ask, "Do we think he did it?" They ask specific legal questions. Was evidence properly admitted? Were jury instructions correct? Did the defense meet minimum standards of competence? The bar for overturning a conviction is high, and intentionally so. If any small mistake could void a trial, our justice system would collapse. But this also means that sometimes valid concerns get dismissed because they don't meet technical legal standards. In Mendoza's case, the courts consistently found that while his trial might not have been perfect, it was fair enough to stand. Now, here's something interesting that came up in the appeals. Questions about witness testimony from the original trial. During Mendoza's 2005 trial, certain witnesses testified about what they saw, what they knew, what happened. But later, during appeals, lawyers discovered that some of these witnesses had given slightly different versions of events at different times. Is this normal? Actually, yes. Human memory is imperfect. People remember things differently over time. Small details change in the retelling. But when someone's life is on the line, these inconsistencies matter. Defense lawyers pounced on them, arguing that the jury heard unreliable testimony. The courts looked at these claims, but ultimately decided the inconsistencies weren't significant enough to undermine the verdict. The core facts remained the same, even if minor details varied. Still, it raises an important question. How do we balance the reality that human memory is flawed with the need for accurate testimony in court? Another issue that came up was about Mendoza's mental state and background. His lawyers argued that the jury should have heard more about his life history, his upbringing, factors that might have influenced his actions. In death penalty cases, there are two phases. The guilt phase, did he do it? And the punishment phase, should he get death or life in prison? During the punishment phase, defendants can present mitigating evidence, reasons the jury should show mercy. Mendoza's appeals claimed his trial lawyers didn't present enough mitigating evidence. Maybe there were things in his past, trauma, abuse, mental health issues, that the jury should have considered. The courts examined whether this amounted to ineffective assistance of counsel. The legal standard is high. You have to show not just that your lawyer could have done better, but that their performance was so deficient it undermined the trial's fairness. The reviewing courts said no. Even if more mitigating evidence had been presented, it likely wouldn't have changed the outcome given the severity of the crime. These legal technicalities might seem dry, but they represent something important. Our system's attempt to be thorough, to give everyone a fair shake, even those accused of terrible crimes. As 2025 approached and appeals ran out, the reality set in that the execution would actually happen. For 20 years, there had always been another appeal to file, another legal argument to make. But now, the road had run out. The final weeks before an execution are intense. Lawyers make last-ditch efforts. Supporters rally. Opponents of the death penalty might protest. Media attention increases. For Mendoza, those final weeks must have been surreal. Knowing the exact date and time your life will end. Watching the calendar count down. April 23rd, 2025 arrived like any other spring day in Texas. The sun rose over Huntsville, birds sang, people went about their morning routines. But inside the prison walls, this day was marked differently on the calendar. By afternoon, the machinery of execution was in motion. Prison staff followed protocols developed over decades. Everything happens in a specific order, checked and double-checked. This isn't something done casually. It's a solemn, carefully controlled process. Mendoza spent his final hours in a holding cell near the execution chamber. He was allowed to have visitors, family members, spiritual advisors, lawyers. These goodbye conversations are private, but we can imagine the weight they carried. He was offered a final meal. In Texas, there's no longer a special last meal request like you see in movies. Inmates get the same food as everyone else that day. It's a small detail, but it shows how death penalty procedures have changed over the years. As evening approached, witnesses began arriving at the prison. They went through security, were briefed on what they would see, and were led to the viewing room. The execution chamber is surprisingly small. There's the gurney in the center, medical equipment nearby, windows where witnesses can observe. It's clinical, almost sterile, designed to be efficient rather than dramatic. At the appointed time, Mendoza was brought in. Prison guards helped him onto the gurney. Straps secured him in place. The 4 lines were inserted into his arms. Everything was done professionally, without emotion showing on the guards' faces. They've done this before. Through the window, witnesses watched in silence. Some of Rochelle's family members were there, faces tight with emotion. Media representatives took notes, knowing they'd need to report what happened. Prison officials stood witness as required by law. Mendoza was given his opportunity to make a final statement. The warden asked if he had any last words. In those final moments, what goes through someone's mind? Regret? Fear? Acceptance? Relief that the waiting is finally over? Mendoza spoke. His words were brief. He acknowledged the harm caused. He spoke about being sorry. Whether those words brought comfort to Rochelle's family, only they can say. Then the process began. In Texas, lethal injection uses a series of drugs. The first makes the person unconscious. The second stops breathing. The third stops the heart. It's designed to be quick and, theoretically, painless. Though debates continue about whether that's actually true. Within minutes, it was over. Medical personnel checked for vital signs. At 6:40 p.m., Moises Mendoza was pronounced dead. The witnesses filed out quietly. Some of Rochelle's family members wiped away tears, though whether from sadness, relief, or the weight of the moment, perhaps even they couldn't say. Outside the prison, a small group of death penalty opponents had gathered with candles and signs. They hold vigils at every Texas execution, regardless of the specific case. For them, it's about the principle that the state shouldn't take lives. Meanwhile, death penalty supporters weren't visibly present, but many Texans believe in capital punishment for the most serious crimes. They see it as justice, as protecting society, as giving closure to victims' families. These two groups will never fully agree. The death penalty debate has raged for decades and shows no signs of resolution. Before we wrap up this story, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on cases like this? Share in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into true crime stories that shaped our justice system. After Mendoza's execution, Rochelle's family released a statement. They talked about finally being able to close this chapter of their lives. 21 years is a long time to carry grief and wait for justice. They remembered Rochelle not as a victim, but as a vibrant young woman who loved her daughter, who had dreams and plans, whose life was cut short far too soon. Avery, now 21 herself, had lived her entire life in the shadow of her mother's death. Growing up, she saw photos, heard stories, but never got to know Rochelle personally. The execution didn't bring her mother back, but it did mark the end of a legal saga that had defined much of her life. For the community of Farmersville, this case became part of their history. A reminder that terrible things can happen anywhere, that evil doesn't only exist in big cities, that small towns aren't immune to tragedy. But what did we learn from this case? What does it tell us about justice, about our legal system, about ourselves as a society? First, It shows how seriously our system treats death penalty cases. 20 years of appeals isn't unusual. It's actually fairly typical. Every layer of review exists for a reason. To catch mistakes, to ensure fairness, to verify that we're executing the right person for the right reasons. Some see this as the system working properly. Others see it as broken, either too slow or too willing to execute people at all. Second, it highlights the tension between finality and accuracy. Families of victims want closure, want justice served in a reasonable time frame. But what if there's a chance we got it wrong? What if new evidence emerges? What if the trial had serious flaws? In Mendoza's case, the courts reviewed everything thoroughly and found the conviction sound. But not every case is so clear-cut. There have been people released from death row after new DNA evidence proved their innocence. The system isn't perfect. Third, it reminds us that real people sit behind these legal proceedings. This isn't just an abstract debate about capital punishment. It's about Rochelle, who died too young. It's about Avery, who grew up without her mother. It's about Mendoza, who spent 20 years on death row before being executed. Everyone involved in this case, from the police who investigated, to the lawyers who argued, to the judges who decided, to the jury who convicted, carried the weight of these decisions. The detective who worked Rochelle's case probably still thinks about her sometimes. The prosecutor who argued for the death penalty believed they were seeking justice. The defense attorneys who filed appeals for 20 years believed in their duty to their client. The jurors who voted for death went home and had to live with that choice. These are all ordinary people trying to do their jobs in an extraordinary situation. So what's the takeaway from Moises Mendoza's case? Maybe it's that justice is complicated. It's not always clean or quick or satisfying. It involves difficult decisions with no perfect answers. Maybe it's that we should remember the victims. Behind every criminal case is someone whose life was taken, whose family was shattered, whose potential was never realized. Rochelle Tollison deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim in a death penalty case. Maybe it's that we need to keep examining our justice system, keep asking hard questions, keep trying to balance punishment with fairness, closure with accuracy, public safety with human rights. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. That actions have consequences, that lives matter, that justice, however imperfect, is something worth striving for. On April 23, 2025, Moises Mendoza's execution closed one chapter in a story that began in 2004. But the larger questions it raises remain open. How should society respond to the worst crimes? What do we owe to victims and their families? What do we owe to defendants, even those guilty of terrible acts? How do we build a justice system that's both effective and fair? These questions don't have easy answers. Reasonable people disagree, passionately and sincerely, about capital punishment and criminal justice. What we can all agree on is this: Rochelle Tollison's life mattered. Her death was a tragedy. Her daughter deserved to grow up with a mother. And whatever we think about how justice was served, we can honor Rochelle's memory by continuing to grapple with these difficult questions. The execution happened. The case is closed. But the conversation continues. And perhaps that's how it should be. In a democracy, we never stop debating what justice means, how it should be administered, what kind of society we want to be. Moises Mendoza's case is now part of that ongoing conversation. A real example we can point to when discussing death penalty policy, legal procedures, victims' rights, and the purpose of punishment. 21 years from crime to execution. Thousands of pages of legal documents. Countless hours in courtrooms. Multiple levels of judicial review. One final injection. One life ended. One family seeking closure. One community changed forever. This is the story of Moises Mendoza and Rochelle Tollison. Two lives that intersected tragically in 2004 and remain connected through the legal system until 2025. Their story is over. But the questions it raises live on.